from wherever you are joining us, and welcome to the third John Menadue Oration for the Centre for Policy Development, which will be delivered by Professor Megan Davis. My name is Travis McLeod. I'm CEO of CPD, and it's a real pleasure to be speaking to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Brunswick West in Melbourne. I want to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the land I'm joining this virtual oration from. I want to pay my respects to their elders past and present, to elders past and present of all the lands across Australia you have joined this Zoom room from, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are present on the video, not least Kirsten Gray, Professor Megan Davis, our orator, and Auntie Pat Anderson, AO, who will each be speaking to you. I want to start with a confession, which Fred Chaney just asked me about in the waiting room, which was my hairstyle, to confess that it's been a long time between haircuts in this household. Friends who have known me since school days have said that my late 1990s mullet is almost back. I'll let you be the judge. But of course, we're still in lockdown here in Melbourne. The CPD team have been working from home for more than 7 months. Our Sydney team are back in the office, which they are loving, but our sincere thoughts are with everyone around the country who's doing it tough right now, many of whom, of course, were already vulnerable before the pandemic arrived. Please understand, though, that this hairstyle is no disrespect to the many CPD board, research committee members, fellows, staff, funders, supporters, our chair, Terry Moran, AC, and everybody who's joining us this evening or this afternoon. You are all distinguished guests. I've actually tried to model it in lockdown on the man that we honour tonight, CPD's founding chair, John Menadue AO. In a year that we've lost some legends of Australian policy and our democracy, Susan Ryan most recently, it's worth reflecting on how fortunate Australia has been to have John Menadue as part of our nation's tapestry. John served 2 Prime Ministers, Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Fraser, was Ambassador to Japan, Secretary of the Department of Immigration and Trade, and CEO of Qantas. He worked across the political aisle and worked to build that symbiotic relationship between government, business, unions, and communities. John told me ever since I joined CPD that he will never retire, which is why he runs that brilliant blog, Pearls and Irritations, with his wife, Susie. John always insists that he is the irritation and that Susie is the pearl. But he continues to be a giant of Australian democracy who has borne witness to some of the best and some of the worst moments in our history. Anyone who's listened to the 11th, the podcast about the dismissal, will have heard John's take on those events that shook the foundations of our democracy. And if you've met John or read his work or heard him speak, you'll know how big his heart is and how much he cares about the future of Australia. We started the oration, the Menadue Oration, in his honour to mark CPD's 10th anniversary in 2017. And it's only natural that we would focus this signature event on democracy. Our first orator was Pak Marty Natalegawa, the former Foreign Minister of Indonesia. We wanted to start with a viewpoint on Australian democracy from the outside, someone who was a key figure in one of the world's newest and now 3rd largest democracy. And the question we posed to Pak Marty was, can democracy deliver? He said Australia and Indonesia had to nurture democracy together, and expressed his fear about democracies adrift or even in retreat. He said that democracy needs constant investment of efforts of nurturing. It needs to be painstakingly built. He said, absent such efforts, democracy can find itself cast adrift, at best irrelevant and distant from people's concerns and interests, and worse still, retreating. Ultimately, democracy will only thrive if it delivers, and it must. Our second orator was the brilliant Italian-American economist, Professor Mariana Matsukato, whose work on mission-led innovation is inspiring governments around the world. Mariana's question was, can the state deliver? She said that yes, it can, but only if we stop talking down the state and tell a story that allows it to deliver in ambitious ways as a dynamic partner alongside communities, business, unions, and other leaders in creating public value. Mariana urged us to focus on missions, and it was wonderful 2 months ago to see her thinking picked up directly in the CSIRO's announcement of a set of national missions for recovery and resilience, which CPD and other organisations present tonight helped to develop. Mariana's oration was at Carriage Works in Redfern in Sydney, very special Aboriginal land, close to where Paul Keating gave his famous speech about the recognition of injustice done to Indigenous Australians. When we introduced Mariana and her work on missions that night in 2018, we said that working together to recognise the Uluru Statement from the heart in a way that empowers all Australians from first to last is our most important national mission. Tonight, as Pakmati and Mariana's orations still resonate loudly in times of COVID, it's appropriate that the first Australian to deliver the Menadue Oration is a truly remarkable First Nations and Australian leader, Professor Megan Davis, a key member of the Referendum Council and one of the architects of the deliberations and dialogues that led to the Uluru Statement from the heart. In an interview that Professor Davis gave to Michelle Grattan last year, she said something that struck a chord with me and with CPD, which was that our legal and political framework is set up to change, that people need to suspend their disbelief that the nation can't change. And in her words, that you must be able to imagine that the country can change and that the world can be a better place. That's what the Centre for Policy Development is all about. We said when we launched the Oration in 2017 that successful democracies are stable but not static. They should change and change for the better. CPD's attitudes research on democracy has found that Australians are hungry for democratic and political renewal. When we ask Australians what they want from democracy, the answer 3 times as popular as any other answer across the political spectrum is ensuring that all people are treated fairly and equally, especially the most vulnerable, way ahead of answers like having the freedom to decide how you live or voting in elections, which we think shows our collective heart. CPD is ambitious for Australia, and we take the development part of CPD seriously. We know that co-design is critical to rebuilding from COVID and renewing trust in our democracy. Our last big trip before COVID in February was to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, the world's largest refugee camp, to follow up on an assessment we led in 2018 on human trafficking risks and other grave threats facing the Rohingya. Around the same time, we finished speaking with well over 200 experts and community leaders about the relationship between disadvantage and Australia's criminal justice systems, coming up with a series of pragmatic recommendations, many of which Auntie Pat made many years ago, to break the criminal justice conveyor belt, one which has made Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people the most incarcerated people on the planet and 10 times more likely to die in custody than non-Indigenous Australians, and we'll release that work in the coming months. At the end of last month, we put out a blueprint for regional and community job deals that was built not just on our analysis on long-term unemployment, but our experience of working in communities like Wyndham in Melbourne's west, Toowoomba in Queensland, and the Riverina in New South Wales on place-based responses to deep disadvantage. We recently formed a coalition with business, unions and climate experts to show how we can win not just on the COVID recovery, but on climate, pushing those proposals deep into government and into our financial regulators, but with a focus on those regions most impacted by the pandemic. CPD isn't a typical think tank. We're independent and non-partisan, but believe very strongly in building coalitions for change respectfully and legitimately through our Create, Connect, Convince approach. As many of you know, because you registered for it back in March, we planned to hold this oration much earlier, but rescheduled it because of COVID-19. We wanted to reschedule it sooner rather than later because we think it's vital that Australians hear from Megan today. There's so much talk almost every day in the news about how we build back from COVID and forge a stronger society. Pakmati told us in the first oration that democracy can only thrive if it delivers. Well, Australia's post-COVID democracy will only thrive if it delivers for our first Australians and accepts the generous offer contained in the Uluru Statement to walk together in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So we can think of no better Australian to answer the question, can Australia deliver, than Professor Megan Davis. She'll be introduced in a moment by CPD board member Kirsten Gray, and after her oration she'll be joined by Auntie Pat Anderson, AO, for a rich conversation which I will very lightly moderate. Please do use the chat function to pose questions, respectfully of course, and we will do our best to get to some of them. And after the conversation with Megan and Auntie Pat, it'll be over to an Australian fondly loved by many of you on the video, probably all of you, Fred Chaney, AO, former Senior Australian of the Year, who will give a vote of thanks. Fred has been a champion for Indigenous Australians for many decades and was one of CPD's inaugural patrons with Julian Burnside when we were established over a decade ago. So with that, welcome, thanks for joining us, and please sit back and listen first to Kirsten and then to Professor Davis.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Travis, for welcoming us here tonight. My name is Kirsten Gray. I'm a proud Murawara Yuwalarai woman and CPD board member. I'd like to begin by also acknowledging the ongoing custodianship of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples right across this nation, and pay my respect to the Dharawal people on whose land I'm on tonight. I would also like to open in the language of my people and offer up the words Galamali to you all. Galumali means to care for, and I certainly hope that in these trying and uncertain times that you are all taking care of yourselves and each other. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to offer my brief reflections on my own experiences at the Uluru National Convention in 2017. Like hundreds of other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I attended the Uluru Dialogues with high hopes. Being welcomed by Anangu people on their country and being treated to the ceremony fitting of the occasion made us all feel the importance of the tasks that lay ahead of us. There were some very hard conversations to be had, and I think in the middle of it all, I remember wondering how on earth we were going to arrive at anything resembling consensus. But we did, and I can't describe to you the feeling in that moment of unity. There was a lot of pride, a lot of excitement about what was to come for our people. When I signed my name to the Uluru Statement, I didn't do it for me. I did it for my children, my family, and my children's children. It was about the promise of something more, something tangible, and something that could secure the future for us all. The line in the Uluru Statement, so that our children might flourish, is really what it's all about. My introduction to CPD came at a roundtable on democracy later in 2017. And I recall my disappointment at the state of our democracy at that time, the rejection of the Uluru Statement. First Nations leaders right around the country were also airing their disappointment at this fact. She may not remember it, but I texted tonight's speaker about my disappointment, and she reminded me that our people know how to wait and that this was not the time to despair, but rather the time to dig in and fight for the changes imagined by the Uluru Statement. You're in for a real treat tonight, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce you to someone who has made an outstanding contribution to democracy in this country, from shining a light on constitutional reform and public law and Indigenous affairs, among so many other things. Here to deliver the third John Menadue Oration entitled Can Australia Deliver is Cobble Cobble Woman, Pro Vice-Chancellor at UNSW, Australian Rugby League Commissioner, and member of the UN Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Please join me in welcoming Professor Megan Davis.
Waiting for the clap. Thank you. That was I could see Auntie Pat tearing up and taking off her glasses. That was quite an extraordinary introduction by Kristen. Thank you very much. It was, now I've got all these flashbacks about Uluru. It was a pretty special and extraordinary occasion. So thank you. And yes, I'm also an Australian Rugby League Commissioner and a Queenslander, so very happy to hear the news today about Mal Meninga coaching the Queensland side for this year. So now that I've got the really important things out of the way, go Queensland, I want to begin by thanking the Centre for Policy Development for this tremendous honour of delivering the Menadue Oration, and also for that wonderful introduction as a Cobble Aboriginal woman. It means a lot to hear that, and the impact of Uluru upon so many of our young people's lives. And also, we take that responsibility very seriously. It's been difficult, or a challenge, I suppose, over the past 3 years to keep our young people believing that the system can change. We still host the same, me and Auntie Pat, Zoom meetings every, Friday night, once a week, for the mob to dial in for 3 years to get information each week on the movement forward. And so it's it's very emotional to hear such a beautiful introduction. So thank you. Look, John is an extraordinary public policy mind, and it's such a privilege to speak in his name, and particularly so because public policy. I'm no bureaucrat, and everybody who follows me on Twitter knows that I'm very overly critical of bureaucrats, but you can't work in my field as a constitutional lawyer or work in law reform at all without having some forensic knowledge or obsession with public policy and bureaucrats. And certainly you can't be in this space without having a forensic knowledge of the history of public policy insofar as Indigenous peoples. And in my time as a kind of 20-year academic lawyer, I've read a lot of material, Hansard material, and how the Parliament talks about and considers Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander matters. And, I look at the Hansard discussions in the lead up to 67, and I'm always just so astonished at the depth of knowledge and care and interest of the parliamentarians of the day. I look at the era of, not era Fred, but the time when Fred Chaney was in Parliament, and just I'm always blown away by the nuance and the texture of the parliamentary debates. And similarly, that Travis referred to my interview with Grattan, that plays out then in the public, among journalists and the media. We all lament Michael Gordon and his passing because he had such an incredibly forensic knowledge of the public policy of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and he was at the Rock with us, and he was just blown away by the fact that we were able to take all of the tension and the disagreement and funnel it through a process and get consensus at the other end. And he could see what a historic thing it was that had happened and what all of us had contributed to. And losing him means we've really lost someone who deeply understood the connection of Uluru and the decades leading up to Uluru. Because, of course, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a culmination. It sits on a continuum. It didn't start with Gillard's expert panel. It didn't start with the Republic recognition of Indigenous peoples as a polity in that preamble. We've been advocating for most all of these reforms for a very long time. So I'm very privileged and honoured to deliver this oration. As many of you know, I was a member of the Referendum Council, and I designed the dialogue process, the deliberative dialogue process that, we used to engage the community. They were not in a space at all when we became members of the Referendum Council to talk about the Constitution. There were some really serious matters of public policy that were going on in Australia in the lead up, including the Abbott government's introduction of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. And so it is the case that public policy that sits and lies around big law reform issues like this do have a huge impact upon how people participate and their temperament. And certainly when, Noel Pearson and Auntie Pat and I rocked up to these dialogues, people were not in the mood to be talking about symbolic recognition in the Constitution. But before I go into that detail, I wanted to just, again, thank the Menadue, I wanted to thank the Centre for Policy Development, because I think it's really important that Indigenous issues, Indigenous law is taken seriously as a category of public policy. And I was really thrilled in 2018 when I was announced the overall winner of the Australian Financial Review's Women of Influence Awards, that that I'd been a finalist and a winner of the public policy category. And I was most proud of that I had been in the public policy category, because that's precisely what this contribution is to. I'm a constitutional lawyer, but it is indeed public policy that drives law reform. And it's important that constitutional reform of First Nations, not constitutional reform of us, but constitutional reform insofar as in our First Nations peoples, that it is regarded as a discrete and serious issue of public policy. It's like climate change, it's like banking regulations, like superannuation, it's like domestic violence. It should be taken seriously as one of those really important public areas that define who we are as a nation, that define who we are as Australians. Because the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its invitation to the people of Australia does set out a really serious public policy agenda, and it will define us as a nation, and it will define us not so much in the way of the many ways that Australians and Australian academics clumsily and cleverly try to capture a metaphor that describes our nation's failure to grapple with the past. And it's not going to define us for our failure to recognise the past and our failure to ask what repair looks like. It won't define us in the way that we've already been defined at, say, the United Nations, in my workplace, where a high-income nation appears to really be struggling with the fundamentals of closing the gap in disadvantage. It will define our constitution, our public institutions, our political culture, and our democracy as incapable of change, incapable of the kind of progression and evolution that is required of all nations as they grow and change with the decades, facing new challenges, such as the many challenges before us now, you know, from COVID, from the economy and COVID, the increased automation and artificial intelligence, to climate change and extinction, and the seemingly irresolvable problems in this country of productivity and the economy, and of course the seemingly irresolvable, to now dwindling university sector, where we have actively and deliberately hampered the engine room of ideas and innovation that drive productivity, and as a consequence, you know, willingly and actively hampering our economic recovery. The failure to implement the Uluru Statement will define the thing that we hold so dear, and that is our democracy, and it is the rule of law. Because it can't be dismissed as something that came out of nowhere. It can't be dismissed as something that, you know, can be easily disregarded as a kind of menu of demands. It is a culmination of much work by Australians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, over decades and decades. It is the culmination of parliamentary committees and other taxpayer-funded state committees, Prime Minister's expert panels and councils, over decades and decades. It well predates this era. It goes way back to ATSIC, the Council of Aboriginal Reconciliation, and earlier. And often the recommendations that our people have come up with are ways to enhance, ways to improve Indigenous participation and decision-making in Australian democracy. And so the constitutional dialogues that elicited the outcome at Uluru should be regarded as a very Australian innovation. It's not an outlier in Australian history. It's Australian. It was part of a Prime Minister's Council. It was taxpayer funded. It was then the subject of a joint select committee that then found that the only reform on the table was a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. And it is one that, or at least a solution that was designed by First Nations people themselves. And this is no mean feat. You know, we are a nation that long ago abolished the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was an independent statutory body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, the embodiment of self-determination, arguably. Its membership was made up of a Western liberal democratic model of ballot box democracy, so voting in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elected representatives through an election. It had not the greatest kind of function in terms of the national level, but at a regional council level, at the regional level, it did extraordinary work. And we heard about that work while we did the referendum council dialogues. And so we've long abandoned the language and the policy of self-determination in Australia, but here we are in 2017, and the First Nations constitutional dialogues and the convention were an exercise in self-determination. And so that's important for us to keep in mind when we think about the topic that I was asked to speak on, which is, can Australia deliver? And as a constitutional lawyer working on constitutional change in this country, especially when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, you know, your life is pretty much waking up in the morning and wondering whether Australia can deliver. And you go to bed at night asking yourself, can Australia deliver? After hanging up on on Auntie Pat and ranting at her for 2 hours of the day's assessment. So this lecture in some ways was made for me. Can Australia deliver? And look, I'll give you the answer up front, because I wouldn't be in this space if I didn't think we could as a nation deliver. I wouldn't be in this space if I thought our institutions couldn't change. And so Travis has foreshadowed, I suppose, part of what I'm going to say tonight, which is we have to have faith that our institutions can change, because they were made to change. They were built to change. So look, constitutional change is not for the faint-hearted. 8 out of 44 attempts have been successful. People use that stat all the time. And about 4 of those 8, I think, were questions at the same ballot. It really actually makes the odds even worse than we thought they were. Malcolm Turnbull used to frequently say, and continually says, that we are a frozen continent. So yes, it's like 4 decades since we had a successful change of the constitution. And look, partly, I think, because as politicians have psyched themselves out. So I'm sorry, I also, the Republic referendum, of course, was in 1999, but it didn't succeed. But I do think the Australian political class have psyched themselves out of constitutional change, unfortunately at a time where we desperately need some changes to the constitution, which I do think most or both sides of politics understand. We do have some serious decisions to make about provisions in the constitution, whether they are parliamentary terms, whether they are who can stand and run to be a representative, the Republic, and of course Indigenous recognition. Now, I don't think that saying that Australia can deliver on constitutional reform makes me a Pollyanna. And when I use that word in my classes, all my students have to Google, because nobody knows who Pollyanna is anymore. But I don't think it makes me a Pollyanna. And partly because I saw when people rang in, there are people who are routinely involved in law reform. You don't make a decision to go on a journey like that thinking that the system can't change. And our people have had to make a really conscious decision that the Constitution can change. And that is how we achieved the Uluru Statement, but also that's how you do achieve the Uluru Statement. I remember in 2017, not long after the Rock, reading a book by Kwame Appiah, the political philosopher, and he'd written this book in the same year of Uluru, which is called As If, and he was talking about the ways in which people trick themselves into believing that they can do things that everybody else says they can't do. And I think that is very much the case of all of those involved in this process, that we proceed as if what is theoretically known to be false is true. We proceed as if what we know to be false is true because it's useful for some purpose to do so. And I think Kirsten and I think Auntie Pat does it really well. I think there's many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are able to explain why it is useful for us to pursue this. And I think she got to the heart of it when she talked about children and Jarjums. It's why they are two issues that are features of the Uluru Statement itself: child removals and youth detention and incarceration. It is useful for us to have faith in Australia's legal and political systems because we have no choice but to get change for our people. And so we've had to ignore for a very long time, particularly this most current iteration of constitutional reform in Australia, the naysayers, the many naysayers who say that this can't happen. And we do believe it can happen, and I believe it can happen for three reasons. And this is our starting point. This is where we begin. To be factual, the Constitution is made to be changed. It does have a mechanism that's built into it that the drafters contemplated would be required because all nations and all polities change. We know that our people were able to change the Constitution in 1967. That is the second reason. We were able to elicit the kind of support that saw 67 be the highest vote in the history of Australian referendums. And a little known story is that when the Uluru Dialogues do get together to yarn about the politics and the law, we often go to Cairns, and just outside of Cairns is a town called Yarrabah. And Cairns and Yarrabah have a lot of people living there who were the big major campaigners for the 1967 referendum. And in the past couple of years, we've gone out to visit Pop Alf Neil, a 93-year-old Aboriginal man who lives out at Yarrabah. And this old man led the 67 and all of the strategy and thinking around 67 out there at Yarrabah, all deeply connected, of course, to the wharves and the maritime employment up there. But they used to sit under the knowledge tree, what is now known as the knowledge tree, with hurricane lamps, talking into the night. And so we would take the Uluru Statement, and we have for 3 years, to that tree, to that part of the beach, and meet Pop Neil, who received an Order of Australia for his services to 1967. And we've taken the Uluru youth out there to meet Alfie Neil. And he's very old now, but he tells us the stories of how they got 67 across the line. And it's an incredibly emotional experience when you're sitting there talking to him in the searing Far North Queensland heat, and young adults, probably men, older men, ride by on BMX bikes and stop to say they remember when they were kids walking on the beach at Yarrabah, and all the old people would be sitting, around hurricane lamps into the night under the knowledge tree, plotting 67, and after 67 talking about politics and other law reform. So the Constitution is made to be changed, but our people have changed the Constitution, and we did that in 1967, and we did that by working with Australians. And I'll return to that at the end of my oration. The third thing I think is something that we forget a lot, I suppose, as Australians, and that is Australia is absolutely capable of the kind of innovation that the Uluru Statement calls for: a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, a Makarrata Commission to supervise treaty or agreement making across the Federation, and a process of truth-telling. And bits and pieces of that truth-telling and bits of agreement making, they're already being done or underway in Australia, not in a coordinated, organised way, but Australia really is capable of change. It is capable of innovation. And I want to say a few things about that, I think, because I think we accept Section 128 exists. We can change the text, and we know that our people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, were able to achieve that in 67 by working with Australians. In terms of Australia's capability to innovate and do things differently, you know, I always look back to my first years at the University of Queensland, and I enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts. That's the first degree I enrolled in, and I'm one of those kids that kind of prepared my major 3 years out. So I remember asking my mum to write to the University of Queensland, to the School of Literature and the School of History, and they'd send back these little books with subject offerings. And so I decided what I was going to do well in advance of university. And as a child, you know, I'd read in grade 10 T.H. White's The Once and Future King, about King Arthur, and I'd read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I was a little bit obsessed with King Arthur. So I decided I was going to do my BA in medieval literature. And of course, that was the great thing about BAs back then. You could study whatever you wanted, and you really did receive a very diverse education. I must have done Latin and ancient Roman, ancient Greek and French and Aboriginal literature and American history. I did so many subjects, including one in the architecture school called the Queenslander, where you studied the actual Queenslander home. But I digress. But the first subject I studied was GT 100, which anyone who went to the University of Queensland or studied politics knows about. It's one of the first, it is the first subject you take in a politics degree at UQ. And it's funny when you walk around the world and meet different UQ alumni. There's so many others that'll be like, I did GT 100 too. But there's two things I learned about that course. The first thing I learned was that I really hated studying politics. I thought I'd be really good at it because I was so obsessed with Australian politics, but I wasn't. I really hated that kind of fine intellectual study of politics. It took the joy out of it for me. But the most important thing I think I learned at a young age, and that is important in terms of formative ideas about the nation around you, was that I learned that Australia was a great policy innovator. And our very excellent lecturers in GT 100 used to talk frequently about the many, many examples of the ways in which Australia had innovated in public policy. And I don't know why, but post Uluru, I often think about that and about the many innovations in public policy from Australia. And, you know, we're talking about things from universal healthcare to innovations in the family court, to innovations in Aboriginal affairs, and there have been many. And I remember, you know, studying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, which was an Australian public policy innovation. And the minister had taken 8 months out of his time to travel around the country to talk to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities face to face about what they wanted in a representative body. And ATSIC frequently participated, as a lot of Aboriginal community control organisations did, at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's really interesting to reflect now that so much embedded in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was led by Australian advocacy and by Australian innovations. But since the adoption of the Declaration in 2017 or 2007, Australia's actually gone backwards. So it's interesting to pick up the drip and see the influence of, you know, community-controlled organisations, to see the influence of ATSIC and self-determination, to look at some of the innovations around the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, Northern Territory, which absolutely is a world, has elements of it that are world innovations. So we know that Australia has the knowledge and capacity to be innovative. And so there is no reason then, when you think about those three things, that we can't achieve the Uluru Statement from the heart. So we know as a nation we can do things even in the field of Indigenous affairs, although it's been a long time, aside from the Uluru Statement, that we've achieved much. We have, though, become too comfortable, I think, with incrementalism, and I get lectured endlessly by politicians and pundits about the virtues of incrementalism. And I often reflect on that and the way in which so many of these people who talk to me as if I don't know the Australian legal and political system, as if I didn't grow up in Australia, as if I don't read the same newspapers, as if I didn't study the Constitution in the same system, that these people understand who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are. You know, I question whether they have any real knowledge about the way we live in this nation. And while it's true that legislation is the bread and butter of the parliament, that is its function, constitutional recognition and constitutional reform is for a very different purpose. We have a constitution, it is the rule book, and we want to use a referendum and the resulting force of law that can come from being in the constitution in a particular way to carve out a durable, a sustainable and certain seat at the table. We would like to remove ourselves from ideology. We would like to remove ourselves from political parties and political jostling and party politics. That is at the heart of the voice. And that is why people would like constitutionally enshrined voice, a constitutionally enshrined voice, and not simply another representative body set up in legislation. What we heard when we travelled around the country was so many mob fatigued by things that the government sets up that the government then abolishes. And we have had multiple representative bodies set up by government, which they then abolish. And it has a really, really detrimental impact and effect upon the lives of our people. We cannot plan for the future. You know, we can barely plan for the next year. And so what we are seeking is something that Australians often seek, and that is certainty. We want certainty that we have a seat at the table. So it's important then to note that when you're reflecting on this question of can Australia deliver, that the process has partially delivered. Australia has already partially delivered. The Uluru Statement is an Australian statement. It comes as a consequence of 6 government mechanisms aimed at seeking constitutional recognition. So that's 6 mechanisms, including a statute, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander People's Recognition Act in 2013, We've had 2 joint select committees, 2 prime ministerial bodies on constitutional recognition, both of which I have sat on. So that's 8 formal taxpayer-funded reports in 10 years. That's a lot. That's not nothing. That's a lot of public policy. That's a lot of work going on in the Australian space. We've had the expert panel on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander in the Constitution. It produced a final report that led to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander People's Recognition Act of 2013. That act initiated the John Anderson Review, and it produced a report. And that was called the final report of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act of Recognition Review Panel. Their report was handed down in September 2014. And then you had a joint select committee on constitutional recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, chaired by Ken White and Nova Peris. It was created in 2013. It produced 3 reports, an interim report, a progress report and a final report in 2014 and January 2015. And then after that joint select committee, you had a referendum council set up in 2015. It was set up to do what should have been done at the start, and that is go out and consult Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on what they wanted. And it handed down its report in 2017, a month after the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And then after that, although many journalists stop at Turnbull's rejection, as if law reform stops at the first no, if blackfellas stopped law reform at the first no, we would never get anywhere. But while Turnbull did reject it in late 2017, he then allowed it in the terms of reference for a joint select committee on constitutional recognition relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So we had a second joint select committee and it produced an interim report and a final report in November 2018. That's a lot of activity in the area of law reform for one area in 1 decade. Australia has delivered 1 decade of 5 mechanisms and 8 reports on constitutional recognition. That partially answers the question, can Australia deliver? So then we delivered the Uluru Statement from the heart, and this was the culmination of a taxpayer-funded process, as I said, that was overseen by the Prime Minister's Council, which was the same as the first one that started the process of Prime Minister's Council. So you are looking at a process that is bookended by 2 prime ministerial processes. So that kind of brings me towards the end of the oration, is what is the problem then? The problem is that other parts of the system that are set up to fairly and credibly respond to something like this fails to end up there and fails to hold up their end of the bargain. What do you do when they fail to do their job? What do you do when the institutions and the representatives fail to do the things that you tell primary school kids that they can do, and high school kids that you can do, and university kids? The things that you are able to do in these institutions and with these institutions, including constitutional change, and you fail to deliver, and you fail to take it seriously, which is what Malcolm Turnbull did, you let the entire nation down. But it's worse than that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because it's not the Malcolm Turnbulls of this world who have to stand in front of rooms of people who become profoundly disappointed, who become profoundly disenchanted with a system that we persuaded them was able to change. And I'll return to this point in a moment, but we, in the referendum council process, we persuaded mums and dads, grannies, old people, children, to take time out of their lives to debate the Australian Constitution for 3 days. And we were going into communities that were utterly depleted by the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, the lack of jobs, the lack of funding, youth suicide, youth detention, child removals. We went into these rooms and we asked people to suspend their disbelief that the nation can't change. And eventually they did, but their first instinct was not to trust our institutions to change. Our people have lost faith in the capacity of these institutions to change, and we don't blame them. So when you get to the end of a really significant piece of work that's been endorsed by both Prime Ministers, the setting up of these processes, the kind of processes that we undertake as a consequence of that expert panel and that council, you ask people to give of themselves to this process, and then they face a shut door. The expert panel, you saw no response from either party. The referendum council, you just saw a straight out no without any public debate or discussion. Without any public debate or discussion, he said no. And so what does that say about our democracy? What does that say about our people's, I think now, very serious dislocation from our political system and our legal system and its capacity to do good? Let me walk you through some of the work that our people did. When Malcolm Turnbull formed the Referendum Council, he came to us and he said he'd been advised by his department that our mob had been over-consulted on constitutional recognition. Now, to his credit, he did form a referendum council. So he did take our advice to set that up. And that's important. That is a part of this chain. And so we then designed this really structured, deliberative dialogue process. So we know the community was unhappy. We know there is tension and disagreement. So we designed a structure that absorbs tension and disagreement. So it allows that to drive the conversation so that we could come to a consensus on a reform. It was a very tightly structured civics and legal process that took seriously free, prior and informed consent. There was a series of legal lectures and debate and discussion on the options. There was civics education, and it was designed on a number of different dialogue and deliberative processes that have been done in constitutional reform here in Australia, during the Federation celebrations, and also internationally, mechanisms like the process in Ireland with their referendum. There was a lot of work that went into the design of these dialogues, and then the work that was done around the country to run the dialogues. They were run in Hobart and Broome and Dubbo, in Darwin and Perth and Sydney. They were run in Melbourne and Cairns and Ross River and Adelaide and Brisbane and Thursday Island. There was one run in Canberra and hosted by the United Ngunnawal Elders Council. And then the final National Constitutional Convention was held at Uluru. And Michael Gordon is right when he says this was completely unprecedented and a historic consensus. It was a very structured and principled model. It was a model that had already been tested, as I said, in other constitutional issues. It allowed for impartiality, so it worked very hard to avoid groupthink. We did not allow each group and their results to be shared by the next group, so we would avoid groupthink and the gaming of the system so that people could push an agenda. It translated all of the work of the constitutional options into relevant languages. We must have had 13 different papers at the Ross River dialogue. We had 4 different interpreters interpreting it into many languages, the Aboriginal languages of Australia. It was open and constructive dialogue, and then at the end it was mutually agreed and owned outcomes. So everybody participating signed off on a record of meeting. So it was an extraordinary effort on behalf of our people to deliver on the Uluru Statement from the heart, where they grappled with questions of political viability and they assessed and prioritised options for reform based on where they lived, the geographics and the politics of where they lived. The level of engagement and the intensity of these evaluation discussions was really high. And I've said this on multiple occasions, I take my hat off to the mums and dads, the young people, the grannies, the elders, the traditional owners who gave up their 3 days to come and talk to us, to talk to the Australian people about their constitution and how they saw so many years after the dispossession, so many years after the killings, how they saw their place and how they felt that they should be recognised. And the Uluru Statement is a monumental achievement of our people. And we're asking Australia to deliver. When we ask the question, can Australia deliver? Well, Australia has delivered part of it. Now we have to work together to deliver a referendum. So out of all of the turmoil, and I'll start to wrap up, out of all of the turmoil of our people's lives, they did suspend their disbelief. You know, we'd get through, and Auntie Pat can talk about this later, we'd get through a day of a lot of very difficult conversations, and they said, right, let's get on with the business. Because we have to believe that these institutions can change. Because now what we look at, and I think a lot of Australians are reflected on this post Black Lives Matter, what we look at when we look across the nation is a pretty unfair system. And certainly a system in which you can't look at, for example, the criminal justice system and think that the rule of the law exists in this country or that it applies to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is absolutely consistent with Australia's legal and political system and culture. This has been affirmed by multiple lawyers, commentators, politicians, academics, jurists, former High Court judges. It's been affirmed right across the political spectrum. So what are we waiting on? We need our political representatives to deliver the rest. It is in their hands that the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its future of voice, treaty, truth sit. And as I said from the beginning, constitutional change is not for the faint-hearted. You know, we are asking people to have faith or hope against hope in an era of policy inertia, decision-making inertia, and great global and geopolitical uncertainty and economic uncertainty. But I'd say two things before ending. I think this year more Australians appreciate the struggle that our people have had with the criminal justice system. About 2 years ago, I was a commission on the Queensland Commission of Inquiry into youth detention in Queensland. And I'm no criminal lawyer. I don't practice in criminal law on a daily basis. But the situation and the conditions that young people have to endure in some of these youth detention institutions are unacceptable. They are unacceptable for a nation like ours. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody has been the subject of a lot of conversation this year. And there's two things to really keep in mind, I think, when we reflect on that off the back of Black Lives Matter. It came up with multiple recommendations to address in the criminal justice system to deal with the many issues that were raised in that Royal Commission. So things that you can do when someone is brought into custody, things that you can do when our people are in incarceration or in youth detention to protect them and ensure that they do not die in custody. And I think it's fair to say that and some of the administrative functions, such as coronial inquiries, and there are people who are much more learned on this than I only read the report. There's a lot of work to be done there in terms of law reform. So the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody spoke about the criminal justice system, but it also said, you know, the one sure way to prevent deaths in custody is if you prevent and stop Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from coming into contact whatsoever with this system. By and large, the system can never protect our people. So the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody has an entire section that talks to the importance of self-determination. It talks to the importance of our people being the decision makers and at the table and driving the agenda. They also use the language of the bureaucracy exiting from the system entirely so that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples can drive that agenda. And that's really critical because it talks not only to the voice, I mean, it doesn't talk about constitutional enshrinement of the voice, but it does emphasise the importance of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people driving an agenda in which they do not currently. And so I think the positive thing to take forward for us in terms of can Australia deliver is that we haven't actually tried, not on that part of the Royal Commission. We have not tried self-determination, and we have not allowed, but bureaucrats have not exited the system. We have not tried autonomy. We have not tried so many of the reforms that the Royal Commission has set down in that report that mean that our people don't even come into contact with the criminal justice system. So that is yet to happen, but it does align itself with the kinds of reforms set down in the Uluru Statement from the Heart. The second point I will make before I end is this. COVID has been a really interesting example, I think, for all Australians of public policy and innovation. I accept that that is because in some ways it was by force, but the Federation and the National Cabinet had to work out a way to work together and to get things done. But what's important to know about communities and COVID is this. Long before the peaks and others came looking to shut down our communities, many of those communities had already shut themselves down. Blackfellas were preparing and talking about the virus as late as late January and started shutting things down not long after that. So it's important to remember and reflect that when Scott Morrison needed to figure out how to lock down a nation to protect its people and to protect its public health system from the kinds of pressure that was happening all over the world and to keep our people safe, he went to our experts. He went to our epidemiologists and our public health sector. When Scott Morrison had to find a way out of that lockdown to reinvigorate the economy, and of course during lockdown to ensure that Australians had food on the table and would continue with the wage as a lot of businesses tanked, he went to the business sector, he went to the economists, he went to the experts in this field. And when he turned his mind to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their safety, he turned to our communities, and our communities were shut down. But not just that, we had a voice, the Aboriginal community controlled sector, that had helped facilitate that shutdown. And so what COVID is an example of is not just what our people can achieve, but it's demonstrated to all Australians what a voice looks like. We don't want that voice at the table just when there's a crisis. We don't want you to make up a group when there's a bushfire. We don't want you to make up a group when there's a virus. We want to be permanently thought of when serious matters relating to all Australians come across the Prime Minister's table. And he could see already just what fabulous expertise and leadership we had in our community-controlled sector. But not just the community-controlled sector, the land councils and the multiple organisations all over the continent that shut down our communities and kept our old people safe. So we can see how a voice works. It's just we don't want that to be temporary. We want it to be permanent. So to finish, our institutions thrive on faith and trust and credibility and legitimacy. And I've got piles of books around my office and offices about 600 years of development of the British legal system and the Australian system about these very fundamental issues. Why do we keep trusting this system to change? And the Uluru Statement from the Heart is a mirror to Australia saying, look how much we've done. Look how much we've already done as a nation. It's just time to bring it home. So yes, can Australia deliver? Yes, it can. And to finish, I'm just going to end by reiterating the invitation that we gave to you as Australians at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention. We gathered here at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land, or Mother Nature, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached to, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished and coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise that peoples possessed a land for 60 millennia and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? The substantive constitutional change and structural reform we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionally, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are aliened from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth, they languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise the process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967, we were counted. In 2017, we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. And we invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Here, what a speech, and what a monumental collective achievement you've just described. I should say I love it that you studied a Queenslander house. If anything shows your love of the Maroons, that might be it. But there's so much in what you said for us to reflect on, and I'm sure Fred will talk about this, but especially the idea that we're natural public policy innovators and that we need to treat debates about this document as seriously as we do climate change and our financial services system. And one of the people watching on that I think agrees with you is Ken Hayne, former High Court Justice, who's spoken powerfully on all three, including the Uluru Statement. And another is probably Gareth Evans, who's there as well, who before entering Parliament, becoming Foreign Minister, was a founding member of the Australian Law Reform Commission. While you catch your breath, I want to bring in Auntie Pat Anderson to join the conversation, co-chair of the Referendum Council and a genuine national treasure who has devoted so much of her life to improving the health, welfare and education of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As I found out recently, Auntie Pat's probably one of the best travelled people as well, from New Mexico, India, the Khyber Pass, Israel, Afghanistan and Europe. She's received numerous awards and at least 4 honorary doctorates. We share a university, the University of Western Australia, where in 1980, Auntie Pat was just the 3rd Aboriginal to graduate in its history. Just think about that. Auntie Pat, welcome. Can you start by telling us how you met Megan, what it was like working together on these dialogues, and any reflections on what Megan has said tonight?
She's not going to like me saying this, but when we witnessed what she just did, I call it that Adele singing at the Sydney Opera House performance. I know she doesn't like me saying that, but they're so riveting and inspiring, and she's so knowledgeable and she impresses everybody. So it was one of those amazing performances that she gives on a regular basis, and we're gonna need more of it as we proceed. I knew about Megan, but I hadn't met her when we were a part of the 16-person huge committee, the Referendum Council. So that's when we first started working together. But I hadn't worked with Megan before. I knew her by reputation, but we had to be working in close quarters. Well, as it was, we were living together as well, as it turned out, for the next year. So we were a lot of close contact. a lot of shared emotions, a lot of distress, a lot of anger, confusion, a whole range of emotions. So I think I know Megan quite well. Well, we're totally different people, of course. You know, even there's a generation almost between us, but that hasn't been, that's served us well, in fact. So it's been a pleasure to work and spend this time with Megan.
And Auntie Pat, how have you found 2020 and COVID? And do you agree with what Megan said in her oration that, you know, the response of Indigenous communities to the pandemic is an example of what's possible when governments let go and place their trust in communities to work together to achieve the best outcomes for their fellow citizens, their fellow elders?
Well, it's the best public example of that, but it's a first across the world in terms of Indigenous people taking hold of this virus, and people did close down their communities, and that saved us. So I think we've done really, really well, we meaning the Aboriginal communities and what have you, not only in the remote communities, but also too, there was a big public education campaign that we launched ourselves on the giving the public health messages to everybody. Lots of stuff was done in languages as well, and it's picked up across the country. So it was a true act, not only of self-determination, but possibly even sovereignty. So it was a really good example. But I like also the example of how the Prime Minister and how the Australian public responded, because we've got a couple of things going for us here. We have a very good public health system, and our system largely works, except, of course, for the gaps or the holes, rather, the weak areas, and that was in the aged care area, where because that's the difference between you and us, if you like, we value our old people. And somebody said, and I can't find the reference who actually said it, but if when we lose our old people, it's like white people losing their libraries, or like burning their libraries down. And I think that sums up that difference in point of view, worldview, about how we see ourselves. I was very touched by that expression. It's like white people burning down their libraries when old people die.
It's very powerful. I mean, it's been horrifying to watch some of the responses in aged care. Quite an ageist response, I suppose, over the last few months. Now, I want to ask both of you, Megan and Auntie Pat, you've both served internationally as trusted experts to a number of organisations, especially the United Nations. And Megan, you've explained elsewhere that the process that was used, the methodology for the Uluru Statement, is regarded as best practice. What's the reception been like amongst your peers and colleagues internationally to what you described, Megan, as the shutting the door, or the distortion by some of the statement and what it was calling for, a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament, not a voice to government? How has that gone down internationally with your colleagues at the UN?
I think for some, they don't listen to the politics, meaning, you know, that just each year they emphasise different UN bodies. You know, when's the Uluru Statement going to be implemented, which is a good thing. But I mean, I suppose having kind of served, I mean, I've been working with the UN for 20 years and probably 10 years as a formal expert, and there is somewhat of a bewilderment at Australia's inability to come at this issue. You know, if I put my UN hat on and think about the numbers of UN member states who have Indigenous populations, we're somewhat of an outlier. We haven't done a lot of recognition within our constitutional framework to recognise Aboriginal rights or Aboriginal participation in democracy. So the primary way in which most liberal democracies have recognised Aboriginal rights in the Constitution has been about democratic participation. So there is a kind of, you know, people are always a little bit surprised that Australia, you know, it still has this kind of residual reputation or image to some extent. Residual, I say, because I think the asylum seeker issue has really blown that up. But it still has some residual kind of acknowledgement as a relatively good middle, nation with a strong rule of law, but not on Aboriginal issues. It's not highly regarded whatsoever, and I think it's a pretty pedestrian reform, constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. So I think people were a little surprised that it was rejected initially without any public debate. So I think one of the key problems for me as a public lawyer is that it wasn't subject to public debate. The report came out and pretty much quickly the Cabinet rejected it. And so we didn't even have that opportunity to have that debate and discussion with the Australian people. And the reason why that's so important is because the nature of politics today is that parties tend to be bipartisan on Aboriginal issues, meaning we're never in the room. They come to an agreement, and that's the way the policy works. So all we have is public debate, and that was taken from us as well. So I think internationally, it's the nature of things that people accept, that politics and Western liberal democracy is pretty limited, and in terms of the ballot box, and it doesn't work for Indigenous peoples. I think people were very surprised because, of course, the Uluru Statement garnered a lot of international attention. We had a mission to Chile just before Bachelet lost that election, and they had a constitutional recognition process in play with their Indigenous peoples. And I remember getting presented by UNDP about this process, and I went, that looks a lot like my process. So I was like, that looks like the dialogue process in Australia. They're like, yeah, we got it from the Referendum Council. So it is a process that's being used by other Indigenous peoples and other democracies as a way of doing what I said, taking groups with many, many different positions and many, many points of view, and bringing it and accommodating and absorbing all of the disagreement and tension and coming out with a consensus position. So I think people understand politics, but internationally, I think there is a not a concern, but people are surprised that Australia finds it just seems to be incapable of coming at this particular issue.
Auntie Pat, anything to add?
No. It's just that once again, we're recognised overseas for what we do and the innovations and our creativity, yet here at home, and the nation didn't want to even have a conversation with us. That's just another example.
Quite amazing, Megan, that by osmosis that process has been picked up elsewhere. I know you've said before that what was critical to all of you in the design process is that the people that had a say were the voiceless people, the people that didn't fly to Canberra to lobby parliamentarians. Can you take us a little bit into those conversations and how you worked to get 3 days worth of discussion about the Constitution and what they wanted from it, a memory that stuck out for one of you, whether it was the Ross River Dialogue or one of the conversations?
Do you want to go first, Auntie Pat?
I'm just there were lots of amazing and moving experiences as we go along, and all of the dialogue started with a fair bit of tension because people were really angry and they were really hurting. That IAS strategy did a lot of damage to our mob, and it was really distressing to see their pain about all that. But nevertheless, I don't know, people sat and talked about the Constitution. I mean, we just contacted people, and we didn't contact them. It was quite a lengthy process. But when people came and we got through a lot of the, I suppose, bit of bloodletting, people actually did sit down for 2.5 days and talk about the Constitution. I don't think Australians generally spend their weekend discussing the Constitution. So that I think that's a pretty amazing feat. But I will talk about the Ross River because this was something that isn't done in this country generally. The Referendum Council wrote a discussion paper with a simple English version, which went out 13 different languages across the country, this discussion paper. And then it was also sent out to all of the radio stations and all of the communities around the country, and people translated the Uluru Statement into not only the local language, but the colloquialism of that particular formal language. So it went everywhere. So that was really really important. To have that simple English version so everybody could understand that. Now, Travis, I've lost the train of thought. What did you ask me about? Oh, yes.
You've answered it, Auntie Pat.
I remember. Ross River. The whole meeting, which was really lengthy and over 3 days, was translated into four languages. So we had to, there was Megan in English, and then three other languages as well. As we got along, people were able to sort of talk almost as the speaker was speaking. But to start off, it had to get up a bit of pace, but it did. So everybody in that room, whatever language they spoke, understood intimately in their own language what was happening. And I think one of the most moving things for me was this old man stood up, and he told us all about the dukta, the dreaming, and what it meant, and explained it in his own language. And I was just transfixed by this amazing story that he told. I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, we didn't record this. We purposely, for right or for wrong, we didn't record anything. There's no audio. We have, and we didn't film it. We have a lot of still amazing photos, but we didn't. And there was a couple of times, well, not a couple of times, these amazing things that happened, and I think, we're not recording this. But anyhow, I think that's probably one of my most moving. But look, at every dialogue, something amazing happened, or something you weren't expecting happened every time. Each one was different, even though we went with, if you like, a fairly deliberative well, it was deliberative, but like a formula, really. The agenda was the same, the speakers were the same. So in every regional dialogue, it was the same. It was the same process, if you like, and it worked. And a lot of the people who came, we selected an organisation, a local organisation, who would be like would be the host, the local host, and we had a formula again for the attendance, and it was 100 people. We would have 60% traditional custodians and landowners, 20% would be organisations, and another 20% for perhaps people, stolen generations or other groups that didn't fit the other category. Although a letter went out under my signature, because I was co-chairing the referendum council with Mark Liebler, they supplied, that host organisation gave us the names. They told us who the 60, 20 people were. So it was done locally, and that happened in every community. Now, it was local people. There were people there that thought they'd do Facebook. They don't talk to their local member very often. So these were just people out there who came and sat for 3 days talking about the Australian Constitution.
Thank you, Auntie Pat. Thank you very much. Megan, to you. And if I can ask everyone's indulgence, we'll run for about 5 minutes over, because we do want to go to... No, Auntie Pat, it's fine. I don't think anyone's desperate to go anywhere. They just want to keep listening. So we'll go Megan, and then I'll invite Fred to give a vote of thanks. Megan.
It's getting dark there, Auntie Pat. You might need to put a light on. I think it's getting dark there.
Put the light on.
It's disappearing. Oh, well, yeah, no, the whole experience is pretty great. I mean, we had accounted for 32 constitutional dialogues. The government gave us enough to run 12. So we needed to make sure that every single dialogue was run exactly the same, because we needed a robust sample. So one of the things we ran the dialogues for was because Canberra, on all sides of politics, were kind of assuming that Aboriginal people would support symbolic recognition in the Constitution. That's not at all true. And that's partly why myself and Kirsty Parker, who is the chair of National Congress, and Noel Pearson and Pat Dodson went to Abbott to say, look, mob will vote no if you go for symbolic recognition. It's not going to happen. And that's partly why the Ref Council was set up. But what we wanted to do was make sure that the process was really robust, ran exactly the same way, and accounted for groupthink, so that you know, it wasn't any, as I said, any particular person trying to push a particular thing that they want. We ensured the invite list, as Auntie Pat said, were community people, traditional owners, but mostly people who never get a voice. So anyone who was in a peak, worked for a peak or ran a peak body like a CEO, they weren't allowed. We didn't allow any of the Aboriginal politicians. We didn't allow National Congress. We didn't allow Reconciliation Australia. We didn't allow any of the key leaders or activists from around the country. That was really key because we didn't want any one person dominating. And the way in which the groups were set up and the discussion and the flow, you needed people not to just be, you know, wedded to their way or the highway. And we wanted to come up with a viable option at the end. And that's why we got Shorten and Turnbull to sign off on all the options. So it was, as Auntie Pat said, you know, in Ross River, my legal kind of discussion took 2 hours in most places, but 6 in Ross River. It was quite an extraordinary experience. But as Auntie Pat said, everywhere we went where it required interpreters, so that our Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people could understand what was going on. It was as a lawyer who was trained in, you know, at UQ Law School and ANU, yeah, it's quite an extraordinary experience even for a blackfellow to see our people engaging with really complex legal reform and constitutional change in their own language. And as Auntie Pat said, every place she went and people would talk about their law and Jukupa and how that related to the Australian Constitution and overlapping or coexisting sovereignty. It's quite an extraordinary experience. And I think that, and as Auntie Pat said, we didn't film because we wanted people to feel comfortable. So we kicked out Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is partly why they weren't happy with us. We didn't allow any bureaucrats in the room and no non-Indigenous people in the room. We filmed everything, but not with sound, so that people could see the colour of the dialogues, but not hear. So people felt restrained from saying things because they might get backlash later from someone for not holding a party line. So we did it in a way that we knew we would give people the best chance in terms of that notion of free, prior and informed consent. And they did a magnificent job. And I think the one thing I really enjoyed was being able to go back to the Referendum Council members, people like, you know, Murray Gleeson, who was really fascinated by the things that our people were saying about the Constitution. And I remember when they first came up with this novel concept, and I took it back to him and I said, you know, do you reckon this could fly? And he's like, yeah, we could do that. And the thing that I really liked about that was that through this creative process where you have citizens participating actively in the design of a solution to their problems and their lives, they came up with a reform option that no constitutional lawyer had conceived of prior to the dialogues. I mean, that is a great Australian innovation. And these people, you know, they're not highfalutin academics or leaders. They don't have little, you know, name identity badges that get them into Parliament House. They're not CEOs. They're not highly paid. That, you know, they are ordinary Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, ordinary Australians who participated in this process in good faith because they thought the system, they know the system can change. And so the whole process was a real privilege, I think, to participate in. We didn't know that Uluru would end up the way it was. The whole thing was extremely stressful, as Auntie Pat knows. We were just racked with anxiety. It only looks like it was fun now, but it was all very, very hard work. And so I can't think of any one dialogue. I mean, it was special when some of my family came down from Cherbourg and Brisbane and like my nieces came and drew all over the Constitution and with texters. Like, it was nice having family come to things. But I just feel like I feel like it was a huge privilege as an Australian public lawyer to be part of that role. I was just a constitutional lawyer. I wasn't a dialogue kind of participant. But our people did a magnificent job. They really did. And I just feel like, it can be really devastating to look at the Uluru Statement and look at the invitation to the Australian people and think that that we can't do it, because we can.
We can indeed. Well, it's been so fortunate to have both of you, Megan, Auntie Pat, and we're equally fortunate, probably more fortunate than we realised, to have Fred Chaney AO to give
indeed.
a vote of thanks. So over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Travers. I must say, I came to this session wondering, Megan, what you would actually say, whether you would be hopeful or pessimistic, or how you would approach what I think is a difficult thing. And when you were introduced by Kirsten, I heard the sort of sadness and disappointment that I've heard so often at meetings with Aboriginal people who say, but we've said all this and no one listened. You've written down what we've said, but nothing changes. And so I just want to say thank you very much personally for the note you struck, which I would capture by not misquoting you, when you said Australia can deliver. And I agree with you on that. And my agreement is based on a lifelong of watching Aboriginal people make demands that were rejected, which were often subject of considerable abuse and criticism. And I think of the debates about land rights, the bitterness of the disputes which occurred about that, and then I see in Australia where native title is recognised and where agreements are commonplace and the world is a different place. So I would say to you, thank you very much, because as a white, a non-Aboriginal person, non-Indigenous person who's tried to work with Indigenous people over the last 50 plus years, if we can't hear what you're saying, then we're simply another colonist. So the clarity of voices from the Indigenous community is absolutely essential to our doing things differently and doing things better. There are so many ways in which Australia is now a better place than it was when I was a boy. We had a segregated Australia, legally segregated. We had a country where Aboriginal people were treated as of with no regard at all. And it was good to see those sort of civil and political rights being gradually put in place. We've seen lots of efforts to make change, but as the Prime Minister observed in his Closing the Gap speech, so much of what we've done has been wrong, it's been top down, it's been ineffective. And the core logic of the wonderful Uluru Statement from the Heart is that if you can't hear the Aboriginal voice, how can Aboriginal people or Indigenous people be engaged in the things that affect them? So I think the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and it was terrific that you finished your address with the full reading of that wonderful statement. I think that sets a framework for us to operate in the future, maybe start of a whole new chapter in Australia. What I think is troubling is not that there are not lots of efforts to come to grips with hearing the Aboriginal voice. You have all sorts of structures being put in place in Victoria, in the ACT, in Western Australia, and no doubt in other parts of Australia. But I think the fundamental problem is that underlying the goodwill in the public statements of politicians is the almost automatic or visceral sense that really the answer to Australia's future is in fact an assimilation. I think that's the only explanation that I can give for why the journey is so difficult. But I think the sort of address that you gave this afternoon, the work that you've done in so many different capacities, the work that Pat Anderson has done in so many different capacities, the antidote to that. The fact is that it is your voices that will count and which will make the difference. Watching Pat Anderson reminded me, of course, of the report that she was co-author of, The Little Children Are Sacred. That report was the trigger for the Northern Territory intervention. The report had was in no way supporting the Northern Territory intervention. It was simply used as a trigger point. And if you want a demonstration of why it's absolutely essential that there is an Aboriginal voice, think back to the intervention, which in my experience has made things worse right across the country. The intervention involved, I think, 500 pages of legislation introduced into Parliament, put through Parliament in a day. No Aboriginal voice was heard. And to me, that's the sort of very harsh example of why the demand for an Aboriginal voice constitutionally enshrined makes such eminent sense. Megan, we're all very much in your debt. I am personally in your debt, and I'm very grateful, and on behalf of everybody listening, I thank you for that splendid address.
Thank you, Fred. And we are in your debt, Megan, Auntie Pat. Thank you very much.
Fred made me optimistic. Working with Fred.
He is a national treasure too, but
Yes, he is.
he said it all. And thank you very much for such wonderful words. It was an honour to listen. As Fred said, we are in your debt, both of your debts, and we look forward to walking together on this movement. As you said today, Auntie Pat, we've got to make it count. It's our turn, everyone 18 and above. And we look forward to doing what we can to make it happen. And as Fred said, it makes eminent sense. And it's a beautiful, beautiful statement and offer to the Australian nation. And as you said, Megan, we have been delivering, but it's only through amplifying and implementing that voice to Parliament that Australia can deliver a future for all. So thank you. Thank you everybody who joined us tonight in the Zoom room from all across the country. The video will be up on CPD's website. The comments in the chat have been wonderful and very complimentary of the hard yakka, as somebody put it, that Megan and Auntie Pat went through. But with that, please take care, look after yourselves, and we'll see you again very soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Travis.